everybody and welcome back to my channel. I'm Kirsty and in today's video I'm going to be talking about two different methods to blend colour pencils. So I'm talking about using solvent and also burnishing, and I'm going to give you some examples of when I use each type of method. Okay, so the first type I'm going through is using solvent, and to do this I'm using the Zested pencil blend, and I'm also just using a couple of paintbrushes. And so firstly I'm going to show you an example of how to use the solvent. So I'm just laying down a Prismacolor pencil and I'm not using much pressure to do this, and as you can see when I'm applying the pencil there's a lot of white grain still showing through. But as you use the solvent, that is going to get rid of all this white graininess because the solvent breaks down all the pigment and it will blend it all together nicely for you. And this doesn't take very long to dry, you just have to wait a couple of minutes before you can work back over the top of it. But it's a really good way of getting a nice smooth coverage and getting rid of all the white grain of the paper without having to damage the tooth of the paper, which means it's really good for getting additional layers and for doing something with a lot of detail. So the way that I apply solvent is that I just put a bit on a paintbrush and I don't use very much, and then I just use circular motions to blend it all together. And you can keep going back in and getting some more of the solvent if you need some more, but I'd rather have less on my paintbrush than too much, because if you have too much then it will sort of drench the paper and it won't blend them as well. So once I've blended it out with the solvent, I'm going back in with that Prismacolor pencil, and this goes on top just like a new layer. So it goes over just as easily because I haven't damaged the tooth of the paper. And then it creates a really smooth coverage, and once you keep building up the layers, then it creates a smoother and smoother coverage. But if you're building up more and more layers, it means that you won't need as much solvent on the brush when you blend it out. So the more layers you apply, the less blender you'll need. So here's an example of me using the solvent in an actual project, and this is the cat eye tutorial that I'm going to be releasing on Friday. So when I did this, I applied all the pencil first. I didn't worry about the graininess because I knew that I'd get rid of that when I added the solvent. And so once I completed the layer of pencil, then I went over the top with the solvent, and as you can see it just gives it a nice painterly look. It looks like a painting once you add that solvent, and it blends everything together and makes it look really nice. And then I can go over the top of it and add all the details I want. So it's really good for fur because you can go in and add in all the hairs after it and get a lot of depth with this technique. So there's lots of different types of solvents that you can use. So I'm using the Zested pencil blend, but you can use things like paint thinner, Gamsol. So there's a lot of different types of things that you can use, but I recommend the Zested pencil blend because it's specifically made for colored pencils and for blending them out. So that's why I like using that. So again, here's another example of me using the solvent, and this is on the butterfly's wings where I wanted to lighten them up and make them look really transparent. So I added the white colour pencil and I blended that out, and then once that dried I added even more coloured pencil and that white pencil to keep building it up and getting it lighter and lighter. So if there's an area where you need to brighten it up and get it a bit lighter, if you use the solvent, then once you've blended it out you can add more white pencil over the top to add some highlights. Okay, so now I'm just going to run through some benefits and drawbacks of using the solvent. So firstly, the solvent is really good if you want to draw wildlife and fur and stuff like that because you can get such a high level of detail. So I always love using this method when I'm drawing animals, and also I use it for projects where I know that I want to build up a lot of layers and add a lot of detail to it. It's also good if you don't like using a lot of pressure. So some people don't like putting a lot of pressure onto the pencil because it really hurts their wrists, especially if you're doing it for hours and hours on end. So this is a great alternative because it means that you don't get the white grain of the paper shown through, but you don't have to apply much pressure onto the pencil to get that result. Another really good positive to using solvent is that it uses up less of the pencil. So when you're burnishing and you're pushing the pencil into the paper, it uses a lot of the pencil up, and a lot of the pencil isn't really used onto the paper, you just have to wipe it away. So with this technique you don't have to apply as much pencil, but then you can blend it out with the solvent. So some other things that are really good about using the solvent is that you don't get any shine, and that it also can be used with all different types of coloured pencils. But some negatives could be that it is quite strong smelling, so you have to use it in a ventilated room, and some people can be quite sensitive to the smells and so can't use it. Also, you do have to wait for the solvent to dry before you can work on top of it. Another thing is that it can be harder to erase the layers of coloured pencil if you use the solvent, just because when you're using that solvent you're adhering that pencil more to the paper and soaking it into that paper. So it's harder to erase than if you use the burnishing technique. So those are some of the pros and cons of using the solvent method, and now I'm going to talk more about the burnishing. So again, I'm just going to quickly show you an example of what burnishing is. And burnishing is basically where you're just applying a lot of pressure to the pencil to really get into that tooth of the paper and flatten out all those hills and valleys of the paper and get a really good coverage of the pencil onto the paper. So what I did here was I used a lot of pressure to get into all the white grains of the paper so that I didn't have any white graininess in it at all, and it did take a lot of pressure, and if you're doing that for a while it will hurt your hand. So when I was doing that it did start to ache a bit, so I wouldn't really recommend doing this technique if you want to do a massive project and you have got a limited time to do it in, because it really does hurt your hand and you will have to take regular breaks. But what I do love using burnishing for is doing portraits, because it gets really nice smooth skin and it gets a really smooth glossy look to it. So here are some examples of when I'm using the burnishing technique, and like I said, I use it all the time when I'm doing portraits because I find that burnishing is easier to control than using the solvent. So I don't like using solvent when I'm doing faces because I really want to get that smooth finish, and sometimes with the solvent you have to have a bit of practice to really get good at it. So it can be harder to get that really smooth polished look with solvent, especially if you want to get quite light areas. So another thing that I recommend using the burnishing technique for is doing cartoons or types of drawings where you have a lot of block colours, because it is really good at getting those block colours down and getting some vibrant colours. So I like to use it for my cartoons, especially on the Strathmore tone tan paper. I really think this technique works well with it, and it will work well on papers that are quite thin and that you want to do your drawings on, because the solvent wouldn't really work well on it. It would just bleed through it and it's not thick enough to take that solvent. Okay, so moving on to the pros and cons of using burnishing. So firstly, it is really good for portraits. Like I said, it can get such a smooth coverage of the pencil that is really good for drawing skin and hair and all that sort of stuff. So I really like using it for my portraits. However, it does make the artwork a bit shiny, so you have to keep that in mind if you don't like the shiny look. And if you don't like the shiny look, then it's probably better to use solvent. But like I said, if you're doing portraits, it can take a bit more practice to get good at the solvent when doing portraits. A negative is that it does flatten out the tooth of the paper. So the tooth of the paper is basically the texture of the paper. And if you flatten out that tooth of the paper, then the paper can no longer hold on to the pencil anymore. So you can't get many additional layers. So if you burnish, you really need to be sure that you don't want to apply any more layers on top, because it simply won't take them. So like I said, it is really, really good if you want to do block colours like cartoons, because it can get you really nice block shapes and really vibrant colours. So one thing that I really like about using this technique is that I like to create my highlights using a craft knife, and that is basically where I use the knife to lift some of the wax off of the paper, and this reveals highlights because it reveals the lighter layers from underneath. And this can be done when you burnish, because you can just remove those top layers of wax off the paper, and this is really good for things like hair, eyebrows and facial feature and stubble and stuff like that. So I really like using the burnishing technique for this, and that's also why I like using it a lot with portraits. So one thing about burnishing is that it does work better with wax-based pencils rather than oil-based pencils. So for example, the Faber-Castell Polychromos, I have found that works better when you use the solvent, because they're oil-based, they're not as creamy, and so they don't blend as well together when you're using burnishing. Another good thing about using burnishing is that it's easier to erase the coloured pencil underneath, because you haven't soaked it into that paper like you do when you use the solvent. So it is good if you want to pull out some highlights here and there and remove the coloured pencil off the paper. And lastly, another positive for using the solvent is that you don't have to buy any additional materials. So like with the solvent, you have to go out and buy the solvent and the paintbrushes, whereas with this you can just use your colour pencils and get started and do it right away. Anyway guys, that's it for today's video. I really hope you found that useful and that you've learnt more about solvent and burnishing and some pros and cons of both of them. If you did and you enjoyed this video and found it useful, I'd really appreciate it if you could share it. And also, if you're new to my channel, then feel free to subscribe so that you don't miss out on my future tutorial videos. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!